How much administrative expenses should I include in the budget for a project, program, or initiative within a grant application? This is somewhat of a loaded question, and there's a lot of things to consider here, and they are grant dependent. So in this video, I'm going to try to break this down so that we can all understand some of the key variables and things that we want to consider when thinking about administrative expenses. I'm Benjamin Dean from grantgating.com. I hope you enjoy this video and others like it on the channel. They're aimed at helping you get more grants. Be sure to check out the link in the description for a free download with 7 additional tips on top of what we're going to talk about today to help you with administrative expenses. So this is somewhat of a tricky question to answer without a whole bunch of caveats to it, because there are a multitude of things to consider with any one program, within any one organization. Okay, so I'm going to give you some of the things to consider and sort of the 1, 2, 3 sort of checklist of how to do it. So the checklist first is really about knowing the funder's guidelines. You have to know not only what the funders require in the RFP or RFA or in the FAQs or in their written material. You're going to have some of that, but you're also going to want to know what they prefer. And these are 2 separate things. You're going to find what they require in the written material, but to get what they prefer, you're going to have to talk to somebody. Now, who are you going to talk to? You can talk with the grants management person who's employed, a staff member of the foundation, say. They are usually the best person to talk to. But other people to talk to would be individuals that are on the grant review committee. How do you get in touch with them? Networking and building relationships. You're not typically going to be able to cold call someone who happens to be obscurely listed somewhere in a press release as being on one of these panels unless you have a relationship with them. That's not looked upon as really the right way to go about things. There's a standard process and a sort of a standard Q&A protocol that most grantors are going to tell you to do. It doesn't mean you have to do it, but it certainly doesn't mean you want to blatantly put it in their face that you're going to circumvent it. Okay, so you got staff members that are designated to answer questions. You've got review committee members whom you are going to network into. That's part of the grant getting process. But you'll also have previous recipients, right? You can reach out and talk with 1 or 2 or 3 of the previous recipients. And I'll be honest, I've hardly ever had a no. I've had I really don't know in some of these conversations talking to previous grantees. But for the most part, I have received hundreds of individual data points to help me write better grants by just talking with other people who have already received grants from a particular organization. Most organizations are willing to just help out a little bit. Hey, I'm writing this grant. I'm looking at the admin expenses. I'm curious how you guys approach this with this funder and if you had any feedback. The answer might be, I don't know. We really didn't have many administrative expenses and it really didn't come up, right? And that you might get that answer 3 times and that might give you a data point that said this is not something that's really prioritized. 3 out of the 3 people that I called didn't have admin expenses, right? So that's to get preferences, all right? That is under sort of the guidelines category. Some of the projects are just going to say, we're going to give you 10% or 12% of the total project cost, and this is going to be for indirect. Now, indirect and administrative are not always the same thing. Indirect, overhead, administrative, these are different terms that might have different interpretations and definitions within any one grantor's guidelines. You need to verify these things. This is the most important point on this topic. Funders are typically most focused on how much money is directly supporting the project's outcomes. So you need to keep that in mind as you're creating your budget and you're creating even your questions and how you're framing these things up. You don't want to be seen as an organization that's just trying to stuff the budget with a whole bunch of, overhead, or what would be perceived as overhead, in order to just get the most out of the organization. That's usually a bad strategy, or not a winning strategy. What you want to do is first have a clear understanding of how your expenses do relate to project's outcomes. All right. And that's going to help you understand these preferences much better. So number one is knowing the guidelines, both required as well as preferred. Then you're going to need to calculate them properly. Okay. So whether they're called administrative, indirect, organizational overhead, or something else, you need to get those definitions straight within yourself and for each grant that you're writing. And then you need to reference, hopefully, what you've already done to segment things out and calculate appropriately for this budget. So sometimes called overhead, the indirect costs or admin expenses represents typically the general operating costs for your organization that can be attributed to this program. Utilities, rent, administrative salaries, insurance, things such as this. How much of this can be attributed to the program? That's question one. And then how much should be included in the budget? That's question two. You have to answer both of these questions separately. One of the questions, how much of this particular organizational cost item is attributable to this program? Okay, the simple one is rent. If you're renting a facility, you've got let's say 1,000 square feet in this facility that you're renting, you can look at the space and say what percentage of time is utilized in what percentage of space for each program. It's easier if you don't even use time, but most examples you're going to have to include time because you have resources such as people that split their time. It's a very, very, very simple calculation if you just put it into a spreadsheet, okay, and you start to label things. So you're going to say this particular office, for simplicity's sake, is dedicated for program A, and it takes up 20% of the office space, 200 square feet in this office. You've got a much larger office, 400 square feet, that's designated for program B. Then you have your lobby. It's whatever the remainder was, another 40% of the total office space is the lobby, which is split between administrative function, 20%, 40% of it is program A, 40% of it program B. And then you just multiply these things out and you have, okay, now I know that approximately 32%, I didn't do the math right, but you get what I'm saying, 32% of our rent of this 1,000 square foot facility is dedicated for program A. And that's what I'm writing the grant on. So my rent is $2,000 a month. Then I'm going to say $640 per month of my rent is attributable to program A. That's the calculation. The second part is to say, okay, if I have a legitimate number of $640 per month in cost for this program, do I want to put the full thing in? Most of the time, the answer is no. Most of the time, if you tried to dump all of the attributable overhead into a particular program that you could, your budget's going to be real wacky. Okay. And so many people are familiar with an individual making a philanthropic donation that they're typically going to be asking, among other questions, what percentage of my money goes directly to the program, right? And this is on your 990 where you get into your functional expense allocation. And that's where more sophisticated philanthropists are going to be looking. Well, grantors are more sophisticated philanthropists. So when you're putting together a budget, you're generally going to be looking in the same range, typically 5 to 20%, right? That's a very big range, but let's just use that range. This is why many grants just say, here's 10%. Here's indirect costs of 10%. And then you don't have to do a lot of these calculations on point 2, which is what to include. You still need the calculations on point 1 because as a manager of an organization, you need to know what you're spending down, or rather what's attributable in terms of grants management and grants reporting. So these things all do connect together. All right, so you're going to figure that out, what to put in there, and then you're going to present very transparent justifications. In the case where you don't have your 10%, just add it in, you're going to itemize these things out. You need to be transparent. Funders want to see that you've thought carefully about your budget, and they appreciate when the costs, including and especially ones that can be seen as administrative, are broken down clearly. Show how the indirect cost or the more indirect costs directly support the project, and provide a detailed explanation of why each expense is necessary. Okay, now what you typically want to do is you want to have some stock language for each of your expenses relative to each of your programs. That will give you what you need from a technical writing standpoint to create your budget and budget justification to be skimmable. So this is a really, really important point when we're talking about budgets. It is not unusual for a grant reviewer to skim. It is actually probably to be expected given the workload that many grant review committees are given and the time period that they have, and the fact that many of them are also working professionals, right? So they're busy, they have families, they have lives, they're volunteering, they were roped into it, they don't exactly know why they're there, they just have some expertise. In many cases, they really want to be there and they really want to help the community, but that doesn't mean they're going to read every single thing you write, multiple times so that they understand it. There is going to be skimming in every section, and there will be skimming, you can assume, in budgets and budget justifications. So one of the technical writing tricks is you want to train somebody's eye to be able to come down and read a lot of information, absorb a lot of information very quickly. Well, one of the obvious hacks in how to do that from a technical writing standpoint is to format everything the same, to start your budget justification with the same phrase, with the same clause, and then include the percentage or the numerical value, whatever it is, sort of in the same area in that sentence each time. So when somebody comes through, they don't have to read the first 8 words or 3 words every time. They know what that is. They can skim. This is a little trick that I don't have any data to show that it's necessarily going to increase a rubric score, but I do know as a grant reviewer and talking to grant reviewers that it is deeply appreciated. You can assume that by taking the time to explain things in a very technical, homogeneous way, that it will be better understood. And that's really maybe what you should be trying to do in the budget justification, is not to convince somebody, but to help them understand it. Most of the issues that are brought up in review committees having to do with budgets are not, I completely understand this budget and I disagree with it. It's not that. Most of them are, I don't understand it. I don't understand this particular cost and how it relates to this project. That is most of the conversation. And then you'll have another person chime in and say, well, I kind of understood. They referenced it in the project description portion of the grant application. And I think that's what they're talking about there. But you're like giving people an incomplete application basically, because you're not doing it in such a way that it is clearly digestible, understandable and digestible. So in the justification part, there's the sentence that you want about for everyone, whether or not you put this in there or not, but you want to be able to say, this expense impacts positively the outcomes for this project by or because whatever it is. Okay. How does it impact the outcomes? Okay. Can be outputs, can be impacts, but specifically, most of the time you're looking at the outcomes. Okay. Now that you have these things in mind, hopefully you have a bit more to think about when you're looking at administrative expenses. Okay. Indirect or overhead. If you want more information, there's a free guide linked in the description for a bit more on writing winning grant budgets relative to this topic. Check that out. In the comments, if you have budget questions, pop them in there and I would love to respond. So thank you for jumping into this video and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.